A company can be right about the business logic and still nearly destroy itself in 3 weeks. That's exactly what happened to Netflix in 2011, and the story is one of the sharpest lessons in business about the gap between what makes sense on a spreadsheet and what actually lands with paying customers. Netflix was founded in 1997 and built its name on DVD by mail, a business it ran for over a decade, mailing red envelopes to millions of loyal households. By 2011, that same company had 2 businesses running side by side. One was streaming, the future, growing fast, low physical overhead, infinitely scalable. The other was the original DVD by mail business, still profitable, still serving millions of subscribers, but clearly on a long, slow decline as streaming took over. Anyone looking at these 2 businesses from the inside could see they had different cost structures, different growth curves, different operational needs, different margins. Splitting them apart, on paper, looked like clean, disciplined management. So Netflix announced a plan. The streaming service would keep the Netflix name and keep running exactly as before, but the DVD by mail business would be spun into a brand new company with its own website, its own branding, and its own login. That company would be called Qwikster. Here's what that meant in practice for a customer who used both services, and a lot of customers did use both services. Instead of logging into one account to manage streaming and DVD queues together, in one place, with one bill, customers would now need 2 separate accounts, 2 separate websites, 2 separate logins to remember, 2 separate bills arriving instead of one. A single service that customers had used seamlessly for years was about to become 2 disconnected services that happened to share a shipping label. And Netflix didn't announce this in isolation. Earlier that same year, the company had already raised prices sharply for existing bundled plans. So customers weren't just being told, "We're reorganizing internally." They were being told, "You're paying more, and also, now you have to manage 2 accounts instead of 1. And also the DVD side is getting a brand name you've never heard of." 3 unpopular changes landed in the same conversation, stacked on top of each other, all at once. The reaction was immediate, and it was loud. This wasn't a slow-building wave of quiet dissatisfaction that showed up in a survey 6 months later. Customers pushed back within days, across every channel Netflix had: support lines, social media, press coverage, forums, comment sections on the company's own blog post announcing the change. The Qwikster name itself became a punchline almost overnight, which only amplified how badly the announcement was landing in public. And the business impact wasn't a rounding error either. Over 800,000 subscribers cancelled their subscriptions in a single quarter, not over a year. Over 800,000 people, in 3 months, decided this was the moment to walk away entirely. Not adjust, not downgrade, just leave. At the same time, Netflix's stock price dropped by more than half within months. That is not a dip. That is the market openly signaling that it thought Netflix had made a fundamental strategic mistake, not a cosmetic branding misstep. Given how fast and how sharp that reaction was, Netflix did something that a lot of companies, frankly, don't have the discipline to do. It reversed course completely. Within just 3 weeks of announcing Qwikster, Netflix scrapped the entire plan. Not scaled it back, not delayed it, killed it before it ever actually launched. The DVD business stayed under the Netflix umbrella. The 2-account, 2-bill, 2-website future that customers were dreading never actually happened for most of them, because Netflix pulled the plug before the split went live. 3 weeks, from big confident announcement to full public reversal. That's an extraordinarily short window for a public company to admit, in front of everyone, that it got something badly wrong. Now here's the part that's easy to miss if you just treat this as a story about a bad idea. The split itself wasn't a bad idea. Internally, it was actually a pretty reasonable one. Streaming and DVD by mail genuinely were different businesses. They had different cost structures, streaming scales with licensing deals and bandwidth, DVD by mail scales with physical inventory, shipping, and postage. They had different trajectories, one growing, one managing a graceful decline. From a pure operations and accounting standpoint, separating them so each could be run, measured, and optimized on its own terms made real sense. If you were sitting in a Netflix strategy meeting in 2011, looking only at internal cost centers and management structures, splitting the business was defensible, maybe even smart. But here's the part nobody expects going into a story like this. The mistake wasn't the strategic logic. The mistake was assuming that a decision which was rational for the org chart would be experienced by customers as neutral, or even invisible. Netflix's leadership was thinking in terms of internal structure. Which team owns which profit and loss? Which unit reports to which executive? How to cleanly separate two cost centers that didn't belong together anymore. That's an internal frame. Customers were never going to experience the change through that frame, because customers don't see org charts. Customers don't know or care which internal team owns which profit and loss. Customers see logins, bills, and friction. And what customers actually experienced was their one, simple, convenient account, the thing they'd used for years without thinking about it, suddenly turning into two separate logins and two separate bills, arriving right on the heels of a price increase they were already annoyed about. The company optimized for how the business looked on an internal org chart. It did not optimize for how the change would land on a customer's actual screen at the actual moment they went to watch something or manage their queue. Those are two completely different tests, and Netflix passed the first one and badly failed the second one. This kind of mistake tends to happen precisely at companies that are otherwise disciplined, because internal metrics are visible to leadership every single day, while customer friction is invisible until it shows up as a cancelled subscription. A clean org chart is something an executive can see on a slide. A confused customer juggling two logins is something an executive only sees after the damage is already done, in a cancellation report weeks later. That asymmetry, in what's visible and when, is exactly why smart, disciplined leadership teams still walk straight into this trap. There's an old idea in organizational theory that any system a company builds tends to mirror the communication structure of the company that built it. Whatever shape the internal teams take, the product ends up taking that same shape, whether or not that shape serves the people using it. Qwikster is that idea playing out at the extreme. Netflix's internal accounting split got mirrored directly into the customer's login screen, with nothing in between to absorb the difference. The org chart didn't just influence the product. For a few weeks, it became the product. It's worth sitting with how ordinary that failure mode is, because almost none of it required bad intent. Nobody at Netflix wanted to punish customers. Every individual internal decision, on its own, looked reasonable to the person making it. That gap between an internal preference and a customer-facing experience is not a Netflix-specific problem. It shows up constantly in ordinary businesses, usually in far less dramatic form, which is exactly why it's worth studying this case closely. Take a company that runs a single, unified customer support line, one phone number, one chat window, one place for a customer to go with any problem, whether it's billing, a broken product, or a general question. Now, imagine that company decides, for internal efficiency, to split support into separate departments. Billing goes to one team, technical issues go to another, general inquiries go to a third, each with its own queue, its own hold music, its own intake process. Internally, that might genuinely improve routing, specialization, and reporting. Each team can be measured on its own metrics, staffed to its own volume, trained on its own domain. But from the customer's side, a single problem that touches billing and a technical issue now means being transferred twice, repeating the same explanation 3 times, and never being sure which queue actually owns their issue. The company solved an internal coordination problem and created a customer coordination problem in the exact same motion, and the customer is the one stuck holding it. Or, take a software company that goes through an internal reorganization. 2 product teams that used to share one platform get split into separate business units, each responsible for its own roadmap and its own budget. Somewhere in that reorg, someone decides the cleanest way to reflect the new structure is to split the login too. Existing users, who used to sign into one account to reach both product areas, now have to create or maintain 2 separate logins, because the 2 products officially belong to 2 separate teams now. Nobody user-facing ever asked for 2 logins. No customer woke up wanting to manage 2 passwords instead of 1. That's friction manufactured entirely by an internal decision nobody outside the company will ever see or vote on. That decision came entirely from a desire to mirror the internal team structure in the product itself. And users are the ones who absorb the resulting friction forever, every single time they log in, long after the reorg itself is forgotten by everyone except the people it actually inconveniences. Or consider a retailer that runs a single loyalty program across its physical stores and its online store. 1 point balance, one rewards tier, one card that works everywhere. If, for accounting or tax reasons, the retailer decides to separate the online loyalty program from the in-store loyalty program into two distinct systems with two separate balances, that separation might make perfect sense to finance, because online and in-store revenue may already be tracked, taxed, or reported differently in the back end. But a loyal customer who shops both online and in a physical location now has to track 2 point balances, remember which one applies where, and possibly lose value they thought they'd already earned. Again, internally coherent, customer hostile, and the two facts have almost nothing to do with each other. None of that customer confusion shows up anywhere on the finance team's spreadsheet, which is exactly the problem. In every one of these examples, including Qwikster, the pattern is the same. Someone made a change that genuinely improved something internal: cleaner accounting, clearer ownership, better specialization, sharper reporting, and assumed that improvement would either be invisible to the customer or, at worst, a minor inconvenience. Nobody sat down and asked, specifically and bluntly, what this change would cost the person actually paying for the product, in extra steps, extra logins, extra bills, extra confusion, at the exact moment they went to use it. And this pattern isn't limited to consumer products either. It shows up in mergers where two back-office systems get combined for cost savings, while frontline staff are left juggling 2 logins for months. It shows up in IT migrations where a company switches vendors to save money internally and never checks whether employees or customers can still do their jobs on day one. So here's the practical fix, and it's genuinely simple to apply, which is exactly why it's frustrating that it gets skipped so often. Before launching any reorganization, any system split, any structural change that simplifies something on your side, ask one blunt question out loud, in the room, before you announce anything. Does this actually make things easier for the person paying us? Or does it just make things easier for us to manage internally? Not whether customers will eventually understand why you did this. Not whether you can explain the rationale if asked. Just that one direct comparison stated plainly enough that it can't be talked around. Apply that question to the loyalty program example for a second, because it shows how the fix actually works in practice, not just in theory. If finance wants 2 separate systems for accounting reasons, the blunt question forces a follow-up. Can the accounting split stay entirely on the back end, invisible to the customer, while keeping one visible balance and one card on the front end? Almost always, yes. The internal need for separation and the customer's need for a single simple experience are not actually in conflict once you deliberately design the customer-facing layer to hide the internal one. The same question works on the support example too. If specialization is genuinely useful internally, route tickets to specialists behind the scenes, but keep one queue, one number, and one visible point of contact for the customer, so the internal complexity never becomes their problem to manage. Netflix could, in theory, have kept the DVD and streaming businesses accounted for and managed completely separately behind the scenes, while still preserving one login, one bill, and one website for the customer. The organizational split didn't require a customer-facing split. Netflix bundled the two together without checking whether it needed to, and that bundling is what customers actually reacted to. That one distinction, separating your internal structure from your customer-facing structure, is the whole lesson here, and it's the part most reorganizations get wrong by default. Not out of malice, but out of habit, because it's simply easier to let the internal chart become the external product than to do the extra design work of hiding it. Before any of this ever reaches customers, there's a cheap check available that most companies skip. Walk the actual proposed customer flow, step by step, as if you were the one paying the bill. Before you announce anything, count the logins, count the bills, count the extra clicks. If that walkthrough turns up more steps than the customer has today, that's the signal to redesign the rollout, not the moment to write better explanatory copy for the announcement. Netflix explained its reasoning clearly in 2011. The explanation didn't matter, because the friction was already baked into the product, and no amount of messaging fixes a genuinely worse customer experience. The broader takeaway for anyone running a team, a product, or a company is this: internal logic and customer experience are not the same test, and passing one tells you nothing about whether you'll pass the other. Before you announce any change that reorganizes how something is structured internally, run it through the eyes of the person who has to actually use it, log into it, and pay for it. If a reorganization adds a login, a bill, a queue, a step, or a point of confusion for that person, that cost has to be weighed deliberately, not assumed away because the internal logic felt sound. That one question costs nothing to ask and takes 30 seconds to answer, which is what makes skipping it so avoidable. Netflix survived Qwikster because it reversed course in 3 weeks, before the damage became permanent. Most companies will not get a 3-week grace period to undo a bad launch. The cheaper time to ask whether a change helps the customer or just helps you internally is before you announce it, not after 800,000 people have already cancelled. More of these on this channel. Follow along.